Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being with us here today. So, hi again. Welcome to our webinar series, Cultivating Critical Language Awareness in TESOL, hosted by the B-MEIS, Bilingual-Multilingual Education Interest Section at TESOL International Association. My name is Zhongfeng Tian, currently the chair of the B-MEIS. I'm really excited to host today's webinar. Our chair-elect Nasia from the University of Auckland is also here with us today. You want to say a quick hi, Nasia?
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here.
If this is your first time joining us, to give you a little bit more information about our interest section, we aim to support and promote all multilingual learners' linguistic repertoires and multiliteracy skills as fundamental to the acquisition of a second or additional language. We believe that additive and dynamic approaches must be endorsed and implemented in educational institutions in the interests of students from diverse backgrounds. We support the opportunity and right of all individuals to develop, construct, and maintain a diverse range of cultural, linguistic, and literate repertoires of practice. And we work to foster collaborative relations of power and address inequitable power relations in society and empower minoritized students to use their own repertoires of practice. So why cultivating critical language awareness in TESOL? First, the landscape and profession of TESOL has been constantly evolving, and increasing attention has been paid to recognizing the linguistic diversity of world Englishes, moving away from the so-called native versus non-native dichotomy, and questioning structuralist ideologies of language standardization. In TESOL teaching and learning, we see the need for more humanizing practices that value multilingual learners' local realities and funds of knowledge, and bringing voices and representation of racially, culturally, and linguistically diverse communities. Coupled with the evolving TESOL landscape is a rapidly changing world, further complicating the backdrop of English teaching and learning with a series of social and political events, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, racial justice movements, and global migration and refugee crisis. Face the evolving TESOL landscape situated in today's changing world, we believe that it is more important than ever to cultivate space for criticality and critical perspectives in TESOL as a means to fight for social, racial, and linguistic justice. So therefore, we organized this webinar series, Cultivating Critical Language Awareness in TESOL, which features 3 emerging and early career scholars' work, with 1 webinar per month from January to March. So each webinar will be recorded and will last around 60 minutes. Please keep your mic muted during the presentation and turn off web cameras. If you have a question or comment, we invite you to enter it in the chat during the presentation, and the presenter will address your question at the end. All participants in today's webinar will have access to the recorded version, which will be available within 1 week after the event. So now, without further ado, let me introduce the speaker of today, Dr. Tasha Austin. Dr. Tasha Austin is an assistant professor of teacher education, language education, and multilingualism for the University of Buffalo Graduate School of Education. Winner of the 2012 New York State Association of Foreign Language Teachers Anthony Papelli Award for Outstanding Publication in World Languages. Austin's work is situated in critical race and Black feminist epistemologies. Through a racial linguistic perspective, she qualitatively examines language, identity, and power, and the ways in which anti-Blackness emerges in language education and teacher preparation. So the title of her talk today is We've Been Off That, Mimicry, Agency, and Politics in Critical Language Awareness. Tasha, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Zhangfeng. Hello, everyone. I want to thank Zhangfeng and TESOL B-MEIS for always just being supportive of critical work. I was introduced to TESOL B-MEIS by Dr. Clara Bowler, who was always interested in the ways in which we could support one another through solidarity and critical language practices. So I'm grateful that you're all here with me on this morning, and grateful to TESOL B-MEIS for always elevating work like this. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Just want to make sure we're good. Zhangfeng, can we see it? Are we good?
Yep. Yes.
All right. Okay, so we're going to be exploring today mimicry, agency, and politics in critical language awareness. And I entitled the presentation "We've Been Off That." In a few slides, I think you'll better understand why. So first, I want to tell you a bit about who I am and how I enter this work. Then I want to talk a bit about the ways that I engage critical language awareness and from what definitions and what scholars I derive my understanding of it. Then I'll put critical language awareness into conversation with TESOL and then with language education more broadly. And finally, as I talk us through one of my empirical works that came out of my dissertation, I'll be specifically looking at critical language awareness with regards to teacher education. And finally, I'll offer some resources and future directions. Oh, my screen stopped. All right, let me fix this quickly. Sorry, folks. Okay, let me share again. Okay, I think we're good now. So I wanted to start by kind of taking us on a journey by telling a story about my visit to Buffalo. I work now in Buffalo at the University of Buffalo Graduate School of Education, and I had the pleasure of having some voice in what I would see and how I would be introduced to the city of Buffalo. And so I asked Dr. Erin Carney, who organized my visit, I asked her if I could see some of the local schools. And so I specifically was taken to a school called Lafayette International School. And you see some images here that represent the immense linguistic diversity at Lafayette International School. But on the day that I visited, something very special was happening. All of the seniors were assembled in the basement. And so the seniors are the graduating class about to leave high school, right, and move on to career or college. And so these students who are overwhelmingly refugee population, refugee immigrant population, minoritized racially, they were all assembled in beautiful garb, playing music, mostly hip hop, taking pictures and enjoying themselves. But the reason that they were assembled in the basement is because they were giving senior government speeches. And they were told that if they wanted to be the senior governing body, they needed to give these speeches in groups that represented at least 3 countries and at least 3 languages. That gives you a sense of the level of linguistic diversity at this school. So these 17, 18, 19, sometimes 20-year-olds got up in groups of 3 or 4 and went to the front of the room and began to give their speeches about why they thought they should be in senior leadership. So the first group got up and they spoke about what they thought they could do in their best version of white mainstream English. Sometimes they were reading, sometimes they were not. The room was full of about 100 other seniors. And so there was talking and laughing and eating and picture taking. And that group eventually sat down. When the second group got up, they took a very different approach. They used Black rhetorical strategies. They used some of the local language, some kind of hip hop vernacular. They were really engaging the students with joking and call and response. But it was very interesting, right, that these recent arrivals to the US were using a different strategy to engage the audience to be elected for senior government. The students in the room continued to kind of chat, but they did enjoy that speech. When the third group got up, they called themselves Women's Empowerment. This was a group of all young women who, when they spoke in standardized to a degree English, but they told stories about feeling like they missed their home countries, feeling the strain of missing their mothers, missing the sisterhood that they enjoyed at home, and how they wanted to bring that kind of care to the senior class. And so again, this room full of about 100 seniors, they continued to chit chat, but they did give some polite applause to the women's empowerment group. Then the fourth group got up. This fourth group got up to the microphone, and when the first person began to speak, they spoke completely in Arabic, and a complete silence fell over the room. They gave their entire speech, one by one, in their home languages. One of the four actually delivered the speech in English, a variety of English, but it was the only time during that entire morning that the room was silent. And I sat with that. And I sat with what it could mean to present opportunities to multilingual and particularly racialized students to have agency in how they want to communicate and for what purposes they wanted to be agentive in the ways that they engaged language, rather than assuming that everyone wants to attain the same standard of English in order to mimic the dominant class. And so in thinking about that day, which sits with me as clear as day in my mind, I think about Awad Ibrahim's work on Becoming Black and how he traces how Somali immigrants in the Canadian context oftentimes would use hip hop rhetoric and vernacular as they recognized that they were being racialized differently in a North American context. I also think about Patrianne Smith's work around transracial linguistic literacies and how Black Caribbean students who are even from Anglophone countries themselves have to fight against the racializing dynamics of the US context when they don't fit into any of the boxes available in institutions. And so for that reason, I want us to think today about mimicry, agency, and politics within critical language awareness. Oh, every time I click, it's not gonna advance the slide, so bear with me, y'all. So in thinking about that, a saying my mom used to always say to me comes to mind: if it ain't one thing, it's another, right? And she was talking about how we as Black people navigate the political landscape in the US within dimensions of subordination and white supremacist ideologies. And so for me, being raised in a very diverse context, much like that of the Lafayette International School, you can see on the left there, that's actually a picture of my senior dinner. And so that was a random group of folks who were friends of mine, but who languaged differently than I did, right? From my Filipina to Salvadorian, Cape Verdean, Puerto Rican, Dominican friends. This is just everyday life coming up in a multilingual context wherein out in the world, we languaged our lives in ways that gave us agency and allowed for us to experience community, right, and upliftment in various ways. But once we entered the school, things changed. For example, when we walked through our high school door, those of us who were racialized as not belonging in terms of citizenship, right, immigrants, those of us who were not recognized as commanding the Queen's English, immediately made a left, right, and had to go to the ESL wing of the building, completely segregated from the rest of us. I myself was not racialized in that way. However, when I went to study language, Spanish or English, I was often told that I didn't have the capacity to reach higher levels. I was denied, for example, the opportunity to study higher levels of Spanish because I was told, you're not a native. And so these different dimensions of social forces that separated us within the institution weren't always the same outside of the institution. School had a distinct stratifying mechanism that we saw play out through languaging. Even as I pursued more advanced levels of language and study abroad, I watched the diversity and the multilingualism that I was accustomed to disappear. If you look on the upper right, you see my study abroad experience, wherein I was the only racial minority in the group. And what that meant was we had distinct experiences, even though we were all working towards developing our language skills in Spanish. And what that meant was, while my counterparts had a wonderful time, me, for example, I got chased out of the metro, right? Because they assumed I was an African immigrant who was selling my wares in the train station. I was solicited as a sex worker on the assumption that I was there to partake in that kind of economy. These weren't experiences that my counterparts had, right? And it had nothing to do with our level of language. And so as I continued to push in the direction of what it meant to be a language educator, I had some different lenses on what I realized language could and could not afford us. And I was determined to share that as I worked with, if you see in the bottom right-hand corner, Saudi foreign nationals who came as mid-career EFL teachers, English as a foreign language. And I was determined to expose them to the various Englishes and the various cultures that are present within English language teaching. And so, for example, a story I remember is that in July, they were very accustomed to looking for the red, white, and blue, the fireworks, the Independence Day celebrations. And that's what I shared with them. They had missed my independence celebration, which was the month before in Juneteenth. And so I think about Mena and Garcia's work on converse racialization and how the way that we language is also marked or unmarked based on the racial category to which we are assigned within specific socio-political contexts. And so in the words of Sean Carter, it ain't where you from, it's who you with, right? And so if we think about language solely in terms of one nation, one language, then we are succumbing to a nationalizing understanding of what language is and what it does. And that's just not the truth of the everyday lives of racialized languagers. For example, while I give credence and I give reverence to the indigenous folks who stewarded the land before my ancestors were kidnapped and sold as chattel, I recognize that we wouldn't have a place to come were it not for the Lenni Lenape who took care of the land that we often call New Jersey, right? And that the relationship and the reciprocity that they respected with how we treat the environment really can give us a different understanding of how we navigate, right? Not just with people, but with the earth itself. But for stolen people on stolen land, oftentimes, how we identify is more about relationships and who we are with, as opposed to land-based epistemologies. And so I think also about my inheritance from my ancestors, my maternal and paternal grandmothers, who you see pictured in the bottom right, who were stopped from advancing in their education, not because of how they languaged, not because of their intellectual capacity, right? But because of anti-Blackness and because of gendered labor, which my grandmother, who still lives in the South Side of Chicago, had to stop school at age 12 because she was told in the 8th grade that it was time for her to continue in the sharecropping and to turn her attention away from education. I think about both of my parents who sacrificed greatly so that I could have the advanced degrees to push the field in ways that challenges the notion that linguistic mimicry can free us. So I am in solidarity with racialized, displaced, dispossessed, and gendered folk who are in economic precarity, not because of their linguistic potential, but because of the racializing societies that sets us on a hierarchy in order to maintain dominance. And so my talk being titled, We've Been Off That, is a nod to Dr. April Baker Bell, who reminds us that as Black people who have always been encouraged to mimic the dominant linguistic standard, we've been knowing that that's not enough. We've been knowing that even if we speak the Queen or King's English in the perfect variety, it will not free us. And she reminds us that anti-racist language and literacy education should be towards various sorts of freedom, that the purpose of knowing how to use language, when and where, and to what degree we can be agentive with it should be for our liberation. For those of us racialized in these ways, racio-linguistic ideologies, the ones that Rosa and Flores outline in their work so brilliantly, is something we're deeply familiar with in an embodied way. And so I now want to kind of present you with my understanding of critical language awareness and the ways that I take it up in my work. And so Jenks, coming out of an Australian context, reminds us that critical language awareness pertains to the fact that texts are constructed, which means they can also be deconstructed. And that if we are unmaking and unpicking these texts in these ways, it increases our ability to have choice in the way that we use language. But bringing it to a US context, I think more in line with Ofelia Garcia and the way that she outlines the three purposes to critical language awareness, from knowledge of the language to knowledge about the language, and finally, the pedagogical practices that can help us develop that level of awareness. Oftentimes when we hear about CLA, it's more focused on number two, the language forms and functions, and how do we compare and contrast the similarities and differences. But I want to really settle into the knowledge of using language across situations and for various purposes, and also thinking about how to design spaces of learning that can elevate that knowledge, not just for our students, but for ourselves. And so in thinking about flipping the paradigm to not think that critical language awareness is only for the benefit of minoritized students, but rather to help us develop teachers, I draw on what Wright calls the need for elevating the linguistic radar of teachers, right? And so we have to think about the ways in which critical language awareness can be leveraged so that those who are instructing the minoritized students come to have a better respect and understanding for the criticality that many of these students already bring into the space. One of my own pet peeves in language education is the arbitrary separation around the goals and the ways that we approach the subdisciplines within language ed. So if we think about ELA and how it is claimed to be foundationally a literacy space, where we do explore genres of language for different purposes like persuasion or information. And then we contrast it with world languages, which is oftentimes hyper-focused on language forms and functions, but very much targeting elite populations. We then are left to consider TESOL as the sole space within the umbrella of bilingual education that overtly recognizes that language access can impact civic participation. And so one of my pet peeves is limiting the notion that access and participation civically is only for specific populations, because that leaves us with the belief system that if you attend to a specific level of linguistic mimicry, then you automatically have access to civic participation, which we've been knowing is not the case. And so finally, I am most in line with Samuel Lim's understanding of critical language awareness, which he says that the need for it is not only to take the student's language into account, but to account for the interconnectedness of language with the larger socio-political and socio-historical phenomena that helps maintain unequal power relations, and recognizing that the US is a still very segregated society. And so just to recap, mimicry assumes that there's a uniform audience, right? The desire and the potential to reach a supposed monolingual standard in order to satisfy the white listening or perceiving subject, which Flores and Rosa outline is not about individuals, but rather entire institutions that serve as these surveilling and policing kind of bodies to determine who can and who cannot claim linguistic mastery. Whereas agency assumes that languaging is for contextualized and culture-specific purposes, thinking about those seniors at Lafayette International School. And acknowledging the politics of languaging permits a purposeful design of instruction that situates authentic language data in the socio-political realities of racialized communities. And so for me as a teacher educator, my work, my dissertation work is called Race, Language, and Ideology in an Urban Teacher Preparation Program. And it was 3 separate works, but the one I want to focus on today had the purpose of figuring out the role of culture and identity within the development of language teachers within Franklin's Urban Teacher Preparation Program. And the specific study is entitled "A Hard Time Seeing the Relevance," and that's a direct quote from one of the participants who I'll be talking a bit more about soon. But for some context and background, Franklin is a large research university situated in the northeastern region of the United States. The diversity at Franklin, interestingly enough, sets it in the top 25% most diverse universities in the nation. But the teacher preparation program looks very much like public schools across the US in that it's overwhelmingly white, right? So even amidst plenty, there is lack, right? Even amidst plenty of diversity, the teacher preparation program was extremely white. And the teacher preparation program, it's important to know, 3 years prior to my study had a shift in its mission and its vision to center equity and social justice. So that's valuable because as I began to interview participants, there was already an assumption that the goals of the teacher preparation program and of the language educators were centered on equity and social justice. And so my curiosity began when I looked at the program designs and the syllabi for various institutions in the region and what their foci were regarding language and culture within the language teacher preparation programs. And I noticed there were immense inconsistencies, right? Some focused overwhelmingly on culture, whereas others almost never mentioned it. And that really got me curious. And so when I did begin to set out to interview the language teacher educators at Franklin, those who taught the methods courses to prepare language teachers, I conducted semi-structured interviews with 3 of the methods instructors across the subdisciplines of world language, English as a second language, and bilingual bicultural education. And then in looking at the data, I coded thinking about Gloria Ladson-Billings' culturally relevant pedagogy, but the particular tenet of socio-political consciousness, and recognizing that language does not exist apart from those contexts in which we enact those practices. And finally, I coded using G's identity as an analytic to make sense of the ways that these language teacher educators centered culture and identity in their own instruction. And so Sharon, Noelia, and Anna self-described in these ways. Sharon as white middle-class Italian Catholic, Noelia as white upper middle-class American with a Spanish background, and Anna as Dominican and American working class. And so Sharon prepared English as a second language teachers, Noelia prepared world language teachers, and Anna prepared bilingual and bicultural educators. And so through my coding, I came up with 3 themes: duality and belonging, helping you belong here, and limited experience, limited applicability. And so I'm going to share with you some of the transcript data, the direct quotes that really fit squarely within these themes, and put it in conversation with critical language awareness and the implications for how we prepare teachers. So it's important to tell you that in learning about how both Sharon and Noelia self-described, I needed to return to them and do a second round of interviews because it was not something that they answered directly. I had to go back and directly probe that specific question. They didn't answer it the first go round. So for Sharon, she said, so growing up, my parents were from 2 different cultures. My dad's family was Italian American, and he was the first generation born in the United States. My grandmother spoke to me only in Italian. I'm guessing I felt more comfortable, but even then, I felt a loyalty to my mom, who did not speak Italian or understand Italian at all. Her family chases back to the American Revolution. So her great-great-grandmother participated in the Daughters of the American Revolution. So this is interesting in that my question around how Sharon self-described caused her to think about herself in different terms, right? She was setting language apart from her dominant identity and saying, well, there was Italian in my life, but I didn't understand it at all. And actually, I was loyal to the parent who didn't understand Italian at all. And she said, and another part in the interview, that her Italian grandmother actually was raising her for a time. And then she aligned herself with the American Revolution and her ancestors with the daughters of the American Revolution, who were a body responsible for auditing textbooks to make sure there were was no what they called anti-American rhetoric in the textbooks. So this is the same group that denied Marianne Anderson the opportunity to sing at their gathering because she was a Black woman. And so it's interesting to see how she elevated parts of herself to distance or approximate to the dominant class or the dominant ideology of the time. And so this makes me think of Dr. Keisha Bryan's work, who talks about from majority to minority, and how Black immigrants who come into the US context oftentimes can't be seen as both Black and English speakers, even if they're from Anglophone countries. And so really grappling with how language and race categories really do co-naturalize one another, as Rosa and Flores remind us. When I came back the second time to ask Noelia the same question, she said, I've always identified myself as American, but an American with a Spanish background. Very often when people look at my name or they don't know me beforehand, they wonder, who is that? Like, who is this Noelia Martinez? Like, what does she look like? And then when they meet me with my blue eyes and my very pale skin, they're like, oh, wait a minute, okay. And so here, Noelia expresses a similar kind of push and pull between who she is and where she belongs, but using G's identity as an analytic, she is being rejected by the institution based on her alignment with dominant white American ideals. And so because of her foreign sounding name, she talks about the scrutiny of not being accepted until she is marked phenotypically as having pale skin and blue eyes. And that makes me draw on Dr. Aris Clemens's work and thinking about the African-American and Dominican boundary difference, whereas an overarching linguistic category like Spanish or a category like Latinidad can oftentimes obscure some complicated colonial histories. And so whereas language might be used in some cases as a unifying factor, which obscures colonial histories, in Noelia's case, language was making her feel distinct and foreign and not accepted in the institutional space. Anna was different in that I didn't need to return to her to ask her about her identity. She was forthcoming just in my asking about her approach to preparing bilingual and bicultural educators. She said, when I define culture for myself, it's the way I view and live life. It's the perspective with which I interpret and live my life. And what does that perspective run on? Traditions, histories, experiences, the people around me, where I've lived, where I've worked, how I speak, who I speak with, and speak with my languages. So Anna actually does something distinct than what Noelia and Sharon do. She talks of herself in a very plural kind of way. She resists monocultural and monolingual norms and actually does not align herself with dominant narratives of nationalism or this kind of blanket understanding of what it means to be American, right? She says, I'm Dominican and American, and she pulls on a variety of different dynamic experiences to express who she believes she is culturally. I went back in the interview and I really wanted to know in the research how they approached teaching culture and identity and preparing language educators. And so my second line of questioning was really around their practices. And so when I began to ask Sharon how she teaches about culture, who is the ESL language teacher educator, she said, we talked about how when someone doesn't have something, you can quietly give it to that person. And you don't have to say, well, you don't have it. You can say, I forgot mine as well. I sometimes cannot place my pencil. I know I put it somewhere, but I forgot where I put it. So in this instance, when I'm asking Sharon about her practices, she refers to a class-centric kind of example of how she insists that the ESL teacher she's preparing promote a sense of what she calls equity and not making a big deal about class difference and folks who do or don't have resources. And in that way, she's really encouraging that her ESL teachers that she's preparing minimize these class differences so that folks can kind of assimilate to whatever the institution is calling for them to be. So we're not so different, we're all the same. Sometimes I forget things, when at the root of this exchange, it's not about forgetting a pencil, right? It's about inequitable resources and where they're put. And so I asked Anna a similar question about how she teaches about culture and identity, and she began to talk about herself as a bilingual person. And she said that she comes into spaces where folks are able to assume that you don't have a language. She said, people still look at you like, oh, your English is too good. Wait, where are you from? No, 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 really, where are you from? Where are you from? What does that feel like? I can speak to that. A kid might not be able to speak to it. I can trouble it. Anna in this exchange is explaining to me how when she's teaching about culture and identity, she delivers by talking about her personal embodied experiences as a racialized bilingual person. And she talks about being pressed and pressured around her identity and how she can't both be a racialized Dominican and American person and speak good English. And so I frame this in thinking about Nero's work on the changing faces of English, where she talks about how important it is that we give learners opportunities to bring in the language practices from the community and do role play and linguistic investigations to elevate the way the different practices can look, and for them to practice recognizing, right, those languaged ways of being within society. Something interesting is that in returning to Sharon and asking still for more practical examples of how she executes her language teacher preparation with ESL teachers, she said, we have a lot of articles that we have them read dealing with culturally responsive teaching. And I show them examples. I give them personal examples as well, using various videos of classroom teaching, where they can see culturally responsive teaching and then dissect it. We always try to take it one step further so that they understand that because they're going to be dealing with Danielson as well as EdTPA, there's always going to be another step. So they need to know that even though it looks like a good lesson, there's always something you could do to make it better. And so here, Sharon is talking about how she leverages the assessment expectations to get the ESL teachers to enact pedagogies that will meet a standard. This compliance approach kind of defers all of the language teachers to the institutional expectations, unlike Anna asserting her own lived experiences to get the students to recognize dynamic languaging as it occurs outside of the classroom. Something else that's interesting here is as much as Sharon was willing to push back against the way that students might be mistreated based on class, when I asked her to give me an example of teaching about culture and identity, she was much more resigned to stating what the institutional and assessment expectations were, and that foregrounded her approach with her ESL pre-service teachers. And so I asked her if she ever experienced any challenges in teaching about culture and identity, and she said sometimes they're not able to make connections, and she's talking about the ESL pre-service teachers. She's talking about reading articles that she provided and said, there's a section about translanguaging. The students had a hard time seeing the relevance of that and understanding the difference between code switching and translanguaging. Teachers outright came out and said they felt it was a deterrent to English language learning. Some felt it wasn't something that would actually be feasible in the classroom because we have several different classrooms where several different languages are being used. The classroom teacher's concern was mainly in comprehending what the students were saying. And so this is where I get the title of the paper from, but I thought it was really interesting how in preparing ESL teachers, again, Sharon was resigned to outside forces like the clinical teachers or what she claimed the pre-service teachers rejected, which was not seeing the relevance of progressive culture and linguistic pedagogies like translanguaging, because they couldn't see the relevance of it. And in that way, being resigned to policies which don't elevate the humanity of racialized, multilingual students, Cushing calls that language policing, right? Wherein we enforce policies which don't center the humanity of minoritized languagers. And Herrera and Bryan also talk about how language weaponization is enacted when those who are on the margins of society really do not get centered in the way that we practically engage in language outside of institutional spaces. And finally, my last example from the study is when I asked Sharon, or Anna rather, similarly, what she did to elevate culture and identity in her practices. And she said, it helps to be bilingual when you're talking about what it feels like to be bilingual. And she says, I'm going to force them to bring in their experiences, what they're seeing and their questioning into their readings, and have those debates and really grapple, because the expectation is that they will see, value, tolerate, honor, appreciate, and harness those experiences. And I think that's where the conflict is going to come up, helping them work through that, because they're mostly white, coming from upper middle class backgrounds. So very differently than Sharon, in Anna's preparation of bilingual and bicultural teachers, she calls out the conflict and she wants to visibilize the challenges and the tensions of being a racialized, multilingual person within spaces that don't recognize your full humanity. And so I think again about Chandel Nero's work in taking pre-service teachers to the Dominican Republic, for them to have a sense of what it feels like for them to be the learners, and for them to be in an immersive space where they're being judged based on what they can or can't do linguistically, and for them to then recognize that they have a lot to learn, right, from those racialized multilingual students. And so the implications of this work, I feel, are legion, but today I just hope the takeaways that you really consider in critical language awareness is, if teacher educators don't see themselves within racialized dynamics of power, how then are they preparing ESOL teachers to support racialized language users? And if equity is defined as assimilation, right, or helping folks belong in a way that erases who they are, then monolingual and monocultural ideals are going to reduce the potential of linguistic goals to mimicry rather than agency. And finally, the lived experience of racially minoritized languagers can potentially increase their ability to disentangle the racial-linguistic ideologies and provide practical modeling for language teachers. And so if we go back to thinking about Lafayette International School and those speeches that those student groups gave, how might ESL or ENL teachers who were prepared at Franklin, right, how might they react to seeing those different groups of seniors and their rhetorical strategies and their language agency as they gave those speeches? They might not see it the same way that I did. They might, but we really have to recognize that the way we prepare language teachers has an impact on how they then carry out the day-to-day instruction with minoritized language populations. So if nothing else from today, I hope you take away that while we know that the majority of our classroom teachers are white in their self-designation, which doesn't mean they're not multilingual, and that 20 to 30% of folks at home in the US are using languages other than English, because of the immense segregation in the US public school system, the likelihood is that there's going to be a monolingual teacher teaching multilingual students. And so we have to recognize that critical language awareness is as much for the teacher educators and the teachers as it is for the students. And so my future work puts that into play. I've taken Ofelia Garcia's work on critical multilingual language awareness and put it into action with some science pre-service teachers and asked them to go out into the community and conduct a material culture and linguistic landscape and see language as it occurs in its authentic context rather, and then start to unpack what that means for the way that they are able to respect and value the dynamic languaging of linguistically and racially minoritized communities. And I leave with you some resources that I find valuable. I would encourage you to go on YouTube and find the free resource of Critical Conversations, where I talk with a lot of the scholars that I named today about racialized languaging, what it means to be Black and multilingual within white supremacist spaces. I highly recommend Dr. Nelson Flores's blog post, The Educational Linguist, which takes very complicated theory and puts it in accessible terms in short readings. Dr. Baker Bell's Linguistic Justice, Black Language Literacy, Identity, and Pedagogy is a text that not only gives you the historical understanding of Black languaging and the ways in which we've been off the notion that mimicry is ever going to free us, it gives some practical strategies for preparing language teachers. And finally, this work from today, you can reach out to me directly and I can share the article, or you can download A Hard Time Seeing the Relevance. So I went over, I'm sorry, but thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
I'll
Thank
stop
you,
sharing.
Dr. Austin. Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate your talk and the rich data you're showcasing. And I totally agree with you. Critical language awareness is not only for students, but also for us as teachers and teacher educators. So now I'm going to open the floor to everyone in the room. You feel free, you can unmute yourself if you want, ask questions, or you can put your questions in the chat. Yeah, I think we have the hands raising feature, right? You can just raise your hand and then you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask a question.
So, Zhongfeng, I was the first presenter. May I ask Dr. Austin a question? Dr. Austin, I'm sorry, I had trouble logging in at the beginning, but I thank you for the personal experiences you shared at the beginning of all your vast experiences. And I want to ask you what you think about why teachers get so offended when they hear languages they don't know. That slide about translanguaging and needing to police and understand everything, like everything that's said in the classroom, like, why is that even a necessity? Can't you let it go if some people are helping or chatting in another language? Why do teachers feel that need to understand everything? If it's in English, you still can't hear everything that's being said. So why do teachers feel that need for control, do you think?
Thank you for that question, Anna, and thank you for your talk, because I wasn't able to attend live, but I went back and watched it, and it was so powerful, especially the publication that the youth made. So thank you also for your talk. That question that you bring up comes up a lot, and I usually take a present day example because unfortunately, there are always present day examples. I'm thinking of one specific year where like a university, not the president, but a higher up at the university wrote an email to these international students, Chinese international students, telling them to stop speaking Chinese in public because they should be grateful that they were at a US institution, something super ridiculous like that. And when we talked about it in that cohort of students with whom I was working at the time, we talked about fear, we talked about control, we talked about surveillance, but we also talked about how unrealistic it is to think that you can understand everything that's happening within a cultural group ever. And so we talked about how when they enter classrooms in high school, middle school, the students will be speaking their L1 English and you still won't be able to keep up. So we talked about the creativity, the dexterity, and the constant updating within like hip hop vernacular and Black languaging, where you don't know what the kids are saying and they're talking right in front of you. Right. And so rather than asking them questions around what could they do to be better surveillors of student language, we talked about the role of relationships and when and why and how students might want to invite you into those language communities. And so we shifted the question from the control piece that many of them were used to. They would talk about how, oh, my teacher used to do that, and that happened earlier this semester in such and such's class. And we talked about how if young people or any group of people who has a sense of belonging to one another, if they don't want you to be a part of what they're talking about, they'll keep you out. And so rather than making it about linguistic codes, we talked about what does it take to develop community and relationship in a way where folks would want to invite you in and actually, and there was an example of a high school teacher who kept a list of all the updated like slang and whatnot, and that the students were teaching him like, oh, this is what we mean when we say this, because they wanted him to know, right? And so I bring up that example because it is possible to be invited into those communities, but it comes through relationship.
Yeah, go ahead. I think Carrie Lee, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi. Thank you so much for that amazing talk, Dr. Austin, including sharing your personal experiences. I've been wondering lately to what extent the professors who are teaching teacher, educator, and leader courses are actually professionally developed themselves, right? You may not know this, but what are your thoughts regarding that? Because they can't teach what they haven't been taught, you know, not that they will even if they're taught that, but can we speak to that a little? Thanks.
Yes, Carrie Lee, thank you for that question. And I think I have similar questions. I know, for example, that oftentimes myself and my colleagues talk about how little teacher educators themselves are given opportunity, time, and resources to develop themselves and to find themselves in the instruction of someone who has actually studied in those spaces or who knows how to engage with linguistically minoritized communities and how to respect it and how to develop their own pre-service teachers in that way when they themselves were not given that level of development. We often talk about how we didn't get it overtly and how a lot of us pursued it because we found it important. And so it became independent pursuits of how do I get better at this and how do I improve it? And so part of my own findings around looking at the way, particularly within that case study at Franklin, it seemed that so much of the language teacher education was based around the lived experiences of the language teacher educators. And that means to say, it doesn't make you automatically eligible to do this critical work based on the body you occupy. But what it does mean is that everybody has to start considering themselves along these lines of race and power. There's no one who is simply not racialized. Everyone is living in a racialized society, which means you have to acknowledge how that impacts the way you navigate your daily life linguistically or otherwise. And so I think that developing the teacher educators like you're talking about, Carrie Lee, is really important. I don't know how much it's happening, but I think that everyone has a potential to develop it because it doesn't just come by virtue of, you know, I was born like knowing these things, right? Everybody has the potential to grow in that way.
Yeah, I also see some comments, some resources recommended in the chat. Keep them coming. Other question? I think we can, we have room for one more question if folks have. Oh,
Yes.
In the chat.
The last slide, I'll share it with Xiangfeng. I have all of my references. I have all of my references from today's work, and I highly recommend every single scholar that I mentioned and more. 40 minutes, you try to like get it all together, but there's so much more. But I recommend the free and accessible resources more than anything. So thank you, TESOL B-MEIS once more, because I didn't have to ask or press you to say, can you put this on YouTube? I don't think that these resources that we all need so desperately need to be behind paywalls. It's really unfortunate that those of us who are self-seeking until we can get this to be a mandated expectation for teacher educators, those of us who are reaching for the resources find ourselves locked out. That's a pet peeve of mine as well. So I will share with Zhangfeng, but also it's on the last slide of this presentation, and the whole presentation is going to go up on YouTube. So thank you for asking about that.
Yeah, and I will share with the organization, make sure they include that in the email to all the registrants. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, I think with that said, it's around the time. So let me just quickly share my screen. Yeah, so I think I'm gonna close today's webinar and also this series featuring cultivating critical language awareness in TESOL. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to our amazing speakers, Anna, Paul, and Tasha. It's been a wonderful journey, and I personally have learned a lot from each of you. I'd also like to thank my B-MEIS team and also the TESOL International Association for your enduring support. And lastly, a big thank you to all the audience and participants. Thank you all for attending our webinar series and being here with us today. If you'd like to join the B-MEIS team, you are welcome to email me and Nashia. You can find our email address here. And we are currently looking for new members to join our leadership team. If you'd like to stay in touch, we invite you to follow our Twitter or join our online forum. And thank you all, and I hope to see you all soon. Take care. Bye.